All right, strap in everyone because we're going deep on this one. React's use effect hook. It's one of those things, you need to master, but sometimes it can be a little tricky to wrap your head around.
I think most React developers have a bit of a love-hate relationship with useEffect.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But that's why we're here, right? To take a deep dive into how it works, how to use it effectively, and how to avoid some of the common pitfalls.
Exactly. By the end of this, you'll have the confidence to use useEffect to its full potential and maybe even, dare I say, enjoy working with it.
I love that. So at a high level, what is use effect really all about?
Well, in essence, it's React's mechanism for synchronizing your components with the world outside of React.
Right. So, like when you need to interact with things that aren't directly managed by React.
Right. Things like fetching data from an API, setting up timers, or even working with third-party libraries that have their own way of doing things. UseEffect is your bridge to all of that.
That makes sense. It's like React's way of saying, hey, I know you need to talk to the outside world sometimes, so here's a dedicated space to do it.
Exactly. It lets you perform side effects, which are basically any actions that have an impact outside of React's rendering process.
Okay, side effects. Got it. But that's where things can get a little hairy, right? I know a lot of developers, myself included, have run into issues with dependencies and those dreaded infinite loops.
Oh, yeah, those can be tricky. But let's start with the basics. Every useEffect hook takes two arguments. The first is a function, which we often call the setup function.
And that setup function contains the code you want to execute, right? The side effect itself.
Exactly. Now, the second argument is where things get interesting. It's an array, and it's called the dependency array.
Okay, the dependency array. That sounds important. What's its role?
Think of it like a trigger. It tells React, hey, only run this setup function when one of the values in this array changes. So if your useEffect depends on a certain piece of data, like a user ID or a prop, you put that data in the dependency array.
So if that user ID changes, React knows it needs to rerun the effect, right?
Precisely. And if it doesn't change, React can skip rerunning the effect, which can be a huge performance win. It's all about making sure your effects are running only when they absolutely need to.
Smart. Okay, that's starting to click. But I've noticed something strange sometimes when I'm working with useEffect. In development mode, it seems like my effect runs twice when the component first mounts. Why is that?
Ah, that's React strict mode kicking in. It's basically a way for React to help you catch potential issues with your cleanup logic.
Cleanup logic.
Right. You see, useEffect isn't just about setting things up. It's also about cleaning up after yourself when the component unmounts or when the dependencies change. For example, if you set up an event listener in the setup function.
You need to remove that listener in the cleanup function to prevent memory leaks.
Exactly. And strict mode helps you make sure you're doing that correctly by intentionally running the effect twice on mount, simulating a mount and unmount cycle.
Okay, so it's like a built-in safety net to make sure our code is behaving properly. I like that. So we've talked about the basics, but what are some real-world examples of how we might use use effect? When does it really shine?
One great example, which is actually mentioned in the material you provided, is connecting to a chat server.
Oh yeah, that's a perfect use case. You need to establish the connection, handle any incoming messages, and then disconnect cleanly when the component unmounts.
Exactly. And useEffect allows you to manage all of those steps elegantly. You can set up the connection in the setup function, handle messages, and then close the connection in the cleanup function.
So when the chat component mounts, the use effect kicks in, establishes the connection, and then when the component unmounts, it closes the connection.
Precisely. And what's even cooler is that you can use the dependency array to control when the effect reruns. For example, if the user switches to a different chat room.
You could put the room ID in the dependency array so the effect would rerun, close the old connection, and establish a new one to the new room.
Exactly. It's all about keeping things in sync and managing those external interactions seamlessly.
This is super helpful. Okay, so we've covered connecting to a chat server. What are some other common uses for use effect?
Well, a very common use case is fetching data from an API when a component mounts.
Right, like if you're displaying a list of posts or products, you'd fetch that data when the component first appears.
Exactly. But it's worth noting that while fetching data in useEffect is common, it might not always be the most efficient or elegant approach.
Really? Why is that?
Well, one issue is that when you fetch data in useEffect, it happens on the client side after the component has already rendered.
So you might see a flash of empty content while you're waiting for the data to load, right?
Exactly. And it also means you miss out on the benefits of server-side rendering, where the data can be fetched on the server and included in the initial HTML.
Ah, so it's a trade-off between simplicity and performance.
In a way, yes. But there are other approaches, like using dedicated data fetching libraries or leveraging framework features that can give you the best of both worlds.
So we might want to think twice before automatically reaching for use effect for data fetching.
Exactly. It's important to know the alternatives and choose the approach that makes the most sense for your situation.
Got it. Okay, I think we're starting to get a good grasp on the fundamentals of use effect, but I know there's a lot more to it, especially when it comes to dependencies. That's where I think a lot of people, including myself, start to run into trouble.
Ah, yes, the dependency array. It's the source of many a headache, but it's absolutely crucial to understand how to use it correctly.
Okay, so let's break it down. When we talk about dependencies, what kinds of things are we talking about?
We're talking about any values that can change and potentially cause your use effect to rerun. Things like props, state, or even variables you declare directly inside your component.
Okay, so basically anything that the use effect relies on to do its job.
Exactly. If your effect uses a prop, that prop needs to be in the dependency array. If it uses a piece of state, that state variable needs to be in there.
And what happens if we forget to include a dependency? Like, what if I'm using a prop in my use effect, but I don't list it as a dependency?
Well, the problem is that React won't know to rerun the effect when that prop changes. So your component might end up using stale data or behaving incorrectly.
Gotcha. So forgetting dependencies is mistake number one. What are some other common pitfalls we should be aware of?
One common pitfall is including unnecessary dependencies, especially objects or functions. You see, React uses a strict comparison to check if dependencies have changed.
Strict comparison, meaning it checks if it's the exact same object or function in memory.
Exactly. So if you're creating a new object or function on every render, even if the content is the same, React will see it as a change and rerun the effect.
Ah, so if I'm creating a new object inside my component on every render and passing that object to the use effect, that's going to cause it to rerun constantly, even if the data in the object hasn't changed.
Precisely. And the same goes for functions. If you're passing a function as a dependency, and that function is being recreated on every render, that'll trigger unnecessary reruns as well.
Okay, so we need to be careful about not creating new objects or functions unnecessarily within our components if they're being used as use effect dependencies. What are some strategies for avoiding that?
One strategy is to move the creation of those objects or functions inside the use effect if they're only needed there.
That way they're only created when the effect runs, not on every single render.
Exactly. Another useful technique is to use the updater function when you're updating state based on the previous state.
Ah, yes, the updater function. That can be a lifesaver for avoiding unnecessary re-renders.
Absolutely. And it can also help you avoid including the state variable itself as a dependency in some cases.
Okay, I'm definitely starting to see the nuances here. But sometimes even with all of these strategies, it can be tough to figure out exactly why a use effect is rerunning when you're not sure what's changing.
That's where our good friend console.log comes in.
Of course. Debugging 101.
Exactly. You can log the dependencies inside your use effect and see what's happening on each render. You can even save the previous values and compare them to the current values to see exactly what's triggering the rerun.
Like a detective following the trail of clues to find the culprit. I love it. Okay, this has been incredibly helpful, but I think it's time to address the elephant in the room, or maybe I should say, the infinite loop in the code.
Yes, those dreaded infinite re-render loops. They can be a real pain, but we'll tackle those head-on, along with some other common use effect issues, right after this quick break.
And we're back. Okay, so before the break, we were talking about some of the common pitfalls with use effect dependencies and how to avoid those infinite re-render loops that can make you want to pull your hair out.
Yeah, infinite loops. They're definitely a developer's worst nightmare, but with a little understanding and the right debugging strategies, you can tame them.
Oh, okay, so we'll talk about those infinite loops. Where do we even begin?
Well, the first thing to understand is that most of the time, an infinite loop with use effect is a symptom of a deeper issue. It's not usually the effect itself that's the problem, but rather how it's interacting with the rest of your component's logic.
So it's like a chain reaction. Something triggers the effect updates state, and that state update causes the effect to rerun and so on and so forth.
Exactly. It becomes this vicious cycle. So the key is to break that cycle. And one of the best ways to do that is to really think about why your effect is setting state in the first place.
Okay, so step one is to question our assumptions. Are we even using use effect for the right reason?
Precisely. Sometimes we might be trying to manage data flow within the effect, when it would be better handled elsewhere, like in a regular function or even a separate custom hook.
So maybe we're trying to do too much in our use effect and it's leading to unintended consequences.
Right. But even if you're certain the effect is necessary and it does need to update state, you still need to be mindful of when it's doing so.
Meaning, are we updating state more often than we really need to?
Exactly. And that goes back to what we were talking about before the break with dependencies. If your effect is updating state based on a value that changes frequently, and that value is a dependency, well, you can see how that would lead to an infinite loop.
Just like that butterfly effect thing, right? One small change can have a ripple effect throughout the entire system.
Exactly. So when you're dealing with an infinite loop, the first thing to do is to take a step back, look at the big picture, and try to identify the root cause of the problem.
It's like being a detective again, following the trail of clues to find the source of the issue.
Exactly. Now, sometimes the fix might be as simple as removing an unnecessary dependency or using the updater function to avoid including a state variable as a dependency.
Right, we covered those strategies earlier, but what if it's more complex than that? What if we've tried all the usual tricks and we're still stuck in a loop?
Well, in those cases, it can be helpful to break down the problem into smaller pieces and test each piece individually. You can use console logs to see what values are changing at each step of the way, or you can even use a debugger to step through the code line by line.
Ah, yes, the debugger, a developer's best friend. So basically, we're trying to isolate the specific piece of code that's causing the loop and then figure out why it's behaving that
You
way.
got it. And sometimes you might discover that you need to rethink your approach entirely. Maybe there's a better way to structure your logic or a different pattern you can use to achieve the same result.
So it's not always about fixing the code, but sometimes about finding a better way to write the code in the first place.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about infinite loops, but there's another common issue that I want to address, and that's the double run in development mode that we mentioned earlier.
Ah, yes, the mysterious double run. It's like React is playing tricks on us.
Well, it's not really a trick. It's more like a safety feature.
Yeah.
Remember how we talked about cleanup logic and use effect?
Right, like removing event listeners or closing connections when the component unmounts.
Well, React's strict mode intentionally runs the effect twice on mount in development mode to simulate a mount and unmount cycle. This helps ensure that your cleanup logic is working correctly.
Ah, I see. So it's like a stress test for cleanup code.
Exactly. It helps you catch potential issues early on before they become bigger problems in production. And this brings up an important concept, the symmetry rule for use effect.
Symmetry, like in math class.
Well, kind of. In the context of use effect, symmetry means that whatever you set up in the setup function, you should undo or clean up in the cleanup function.
So it's like a balancing act. When you open, you must close.
Exactly. For every action, there should be an equal and opposite reaction. If you set up an interval in the setup function, you clear that interval in the cleanup function. If you add an event listener, you remove it.
Okay, that makes sense. It's all about keeping things tidy and predictable. But sometimes, even with all of these precautions, we might encounter unexpected behavior. Like, what if our component is updating too frequently, causing performance issues or visual glitches?
That's a great point, and it brings us to another important aspect of use effect, performance optimization. You see, every time a use effect runs, it can potentially trigger a re-render of the component. And if those re-renders are happening too often, it can lead to a sluggish user experience.
Right, because all those re-renders can put a strain on the browser, especially if you're dealing with complex components or large amounts of data.
Exactly. So how do we avoid that? Well, we've already discussed some key strategies, like using the dependency array correctly, avoiding unnecessary recreations of objects and functions, and leveraging the updater function for state updates. But there are a few other techniques that can be helpful as well.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
One technique is called memoization. It's a fancy word for caching the results of expensive computations so you don't have to repeat them every time.
So if you have a function that does a lot of heavy lifting, you can store the result of that function and reuse it if the input hasn't changed.
Exactly. React provides a built-in hook called useMemo that can help you do this easily.
Use memo. I'll have to check that out. What else?
Another technique is called debouncing. This is useful for situations where you want to limit how often an action is performed, like when a user is typing into a search box, and you want to avoid making an API request on every single keystroke.
Right, because you don't want to overwhelm the server with requests, and you also want to give the user a chance to finish typing before you start searching.
Exactly. With debouncing, you essentially set a timer. And if the action is performed again before the timer expires, you reset the timer. This ensures that the action is only performed once after a certain period of inactivity.
Uh, that's a clever way to throttle things down. So we have memorization for caching results and debouncing for limiting actions. Any other performance optimization tips?
Well, sometimes the best optimization is simply to avoid doing work that doesn't need to be done.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning that if you have logic in your use effect that doesn't actually depend on any reactive values, you might be able to move that logic outside of the effect entirely.
So if it's just some static computation or initialization code that only needs to run once, it doesn't necessarily need to live inside the use effect.
Exactly. Keep your effects lean and focused on the tasks that truly require them. And finally, always remember that profiling your application is key to identifying performance bottlenecks.
Right, because you can't optimize what you can't measure. Tools like React's built-in profiler or the Chrome Dev tools can help you see where your app is spending its time and identify areas for improvement.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from infinite loops to performance optimization. Are there any other essential aspects of use effect that we need to address before we wrap things up?
Well, there's one more thing that comes to mind. We've talked about how useEffect lets us synchronize with the outside world, but what about when we need to synchronize with other parts of our own React application?
That's a great question. And it brings us to the concept of communication between components and the role that use effect can play in facilitating that communication. We'll dive into that along with some final thoughts and key takeaways in the last part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the final stretch of our useEffect deep dive. It's been quite a journey exploring all the ins and outs of this powerful hook.
It really has. We've covered a lot of ground, from the fundamentals to some more advanced techniques and troubleshooting strategies.
Definitely. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how useEffect works and how to use it effectively. But as with anything in programming, there's always more to learn, right?
Absolutely. React is constantly evolving, and the way we use use effect might change over time as new patterns and best practices emerge.
That's true. So how can our listeners stay up to date with the latest and greatest in the world of useEffect? Any resources you recommend?
Well, the first stop should always be the official React documentation. They do a fantastic job of keeping the docs up to date and providing clear explanations and examples.
The official docs are a lifesaver. I refer to them all the time. But sometimes you need a little bit more, like a deeper dive into specific use cases or maybe more interactive learning experience.
Right. For that, I highly recommend checking out online courses and tutorials. Platforms like Frontend Masters and Egghead.io have some amazing content on React, including in-depth coverage of use effect.
Those are great resources. And of course, we can't forget about the incredible React community online.
Absolutely. The React community is incredibly active and supportive. There are forums like Reactiflux and Stack Overflow where you can ask questions, share your experiences, and get help from other developers.
I've definitely gotten myself out of a few tricky situations thanks to the React community. It's amazing how willing people are to share their knowledge and help each other out.
It really is. And I encourage everyone listening to contribute to the community as well. Sharing your own learnings, whether it's through blog posts, code snippets, or even just answering questions on forums, can make a big difference.
Love that. Paying it forward in the world of React. Okay, so before we officially wrap up this deep dive, any final words of wisdom you want to leave our listeners with? Any key takeaways that you think are essential for mastering use effect?
Let me think. I guess if I had to boil it down to a few key principles, I would say first and foremost, strive for clarity and simplicity in your use effect code. The easier it is to understand what your effect is doing, the easier it will be to debug and maintain.
Keep it clean, keep it simple. Solid advice for any kind of coding, really.
Exactly. Second, remember the importance of separation of concerns. If you have a use effect that's handling multiple unrelated tasks, consider breaking it up into smaller, more focused effects.
Divide and conquer. Makes things much more manageable.
You got it. And finally, remember that use effect is a powerful tool, but it's not always the right tool for the job. Sometimes a simple state update or a well-placed ref can achieve the same result without the added complexity of an effect.
Don't overuse it. Choose the right tool for the job, which again is good advice in any area of life, not just programming.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, I think that about covers it.
I think so too. We've really gone deep on this one. We've covered the fundamentals, the gotchas, the best practices, and even some advanced techniques. I feel like we've given our listeners everything they need to tame the use effect beast and make it work for them.
I hope so. And remember, the learning never stops. Keep experimenting, keep exploring, and keep pushing the boundaries of what you can do with React.
Couldn't have said it better myself. To all our listeners out there, happy